You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host for today, April Lawson. And I have the privilege of being joined today by Heather Hying. Heather, thank you so much for coming on our podcast and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here.
Yeah, Heather is a thought leader. She's a professor, a thought leader in the what some people call the intellectual dark web on free speech issues and social justice. And we're just very lucky to have her here to talk to us about what it means to speak freely, think freely, engage in a complex climate these days. And yeah, like I said, Heather, we're just really happy to have you. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say to let folks know who you are.
I think it'll come out as we talk, really.
I'm sure it will.
Yeah.
I'm sure it will. Okay, wonderful. Well, I also just want to share with the audience, I'm particularly excited to be the one who drew the good straw and gets to interview Heather, because I think it's going to give us a chance to get into issues that Braver Angels doesn't engage enough around feminism and gender and social justice and what all that looks like in the context of a deeply diverse country that is committed to certain principles of thought. So I think this will be great. Yeah. So I think we should start off, Heather, just if you would tell folks a little bit about sort of what the last few years of your career have been like. I know that you're a biology professor, and is that evolutionary biology? That's right. Yeah.
Evolutionary biology, that's right.
Yep, I was reading your article that talked about frogs, and anyway, it's way above my head. But yeah, I'd like to know just like how the last few years have been for you professionally, and tell us, of course, especially about the Evergreen experience and sort of where all that has led you.
Yeah, well, I'll try to do this in brief. I got my PhD from University of Michigan back in 2001, and in 2002 was privileged to be able to choose between two job offers, tenure-track job offers at two different liberal arts colleges.
Wow.
And I took the one at the Evergreen State College up in Olympia, Washington, for three main reasons. One was that it was just a beautiful area and I wanted to live there. So that's maybe the most banal, but the two, yeah. And the two others were, it had a unique pedagogical structure in which students didn't take 3, 4, or 5 classes at a time. They took one full-time immersive program with 1, 2, or 3 faculty. And those programs could last for a single quarter up to a whole year. And so over time, I came to just utterly love the ability to really innovate educationally. And I never thought of myself as a teacher. I never thought of myself as an educator. I'm really, I love being in the field. I love doing research, and I'm a pretty strong introvert. So the idea that I would fall in love with educating was a bit of a surprise to me. And I think the model that Evergreen afforded really just showed me something that is missing from almost every other educational experience I've ever seen. And the other thing that really attracted me about Evergreen was the socioeconomic diversity. And every other liberal arts college pretty much is private, right?
Yeah.
And so while there are, of course, grants and opportunities for students from, middle and lower class backgrounds, they're always a minority. Right. And Evergreen was actually, it really is a fallen college at this point, but it was a public liberal arts college that had so many first generation in college students, so many students who were older, who had already raised families and were coming back to school, who were veterans, who were doing any number of things. And, often they were putting themselves through college. And then among the more, traditional aged and, apparently traditional students, I had a lot of homeschooled students, unschooled students. And so, the diversity of people arriving in my classroom was amazing. And the ability to spend time like teaching without only teaching to the already privileged, the already elite was really quite a gift. So I did that, and my husband, Brett Weinstein, came on board at Evergreen about a year after I did, and we did that, and I had children early in my time there. We raised our family in Olympia, and then a couple of years ago, the the movement, the woke movement, the intersectionals, the postmoderns, there are a lot of ways to describe it, sort of showed up on campus around the same time as we got a new president. And the new president of the college, signed up with them, made sort of deals with the devil. And I was on sabbatical for most of when this was happening, but Brett, my husband, started really firmly, respectfully, but reliably pushing back against the changes to policy that were being pushed by the social justice mob on campus, which was at that point really entirely faculty and staff, and just a small group of faculty and staff. But just like we see in so many places in modern culture now, they were loud and they took power and they made it seem like they were a much larger majority than they actually were. And people were afraid before them and were silent in the face of the nonsense, except for Brett. So three and a half years ago now, May 23rd of 2017, a group of about 50 students showed up in his classroom, none of whom he had ever met before. And the students expected his students to defect. And as they called for his resignation for objecting to, frankly, racist new policy on campus, his students stood by him. They were staunch. They were loyal, as really our students just were, because we were able to form these deep relationships and challenge them and allow them to challenge us. And this is what could happen at Evergreen. That was what an educational model could look like. It was amazing. But what had grabbed Evergreen was not amazing. And the administration caved. Many of the faculty and staff caved, and very, very long story short, about which you can watch and read many versions online. In just before classes started in fall of 2017, we took a settlement with the college in exchange for leaving these positions that we loved and imagined. By that time, we were both tenured, and so these were positions in which we had job security. And suddenly there was, in fact, no way to keep the jobs while remaining true to our values of an actual equal and fair society.
That's a strong statement, that you had no way of keeping both your jobs and your values. It's funny because we hear that periodically in lots of different contexts. I think most people don't think of it as something that you would hear in this context. And I'd just like it if you would tell me a little bit more about, like, I don't know, how did you feel at different points? Like, what was that? It must have been hard on your family.
Indeed. Yeah, it was, it's probably been by turns every emotion that you could name. And, at this point, 3+ years out, less than 3 years out from parting ways with the college officially. At this point, I've certainly felt exhilaration and optimism and hope. But with regard to watching an institution that had such great potential, and frankly, Brett and I realized that potential in our classrooms, in the field, with our students, year after year after year, to see it fall, I was outraged. I was angry. I was heartbroken. I was, one of my core values as an individual is loyalty. And I felt such loyalty to the institution, and to see it turn on me and Brett with such alacrity, like it almost didn't pause, was terrifying as well. And certainly we had moments of actual terror. At one moment, we, at the strong advice of our family and friends, actually fled the state with our children because,
oh my goodness,
the protesters, and much like the protests in the streets of major cities in the U.S. right now, including Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm talking to you from, which is my hometown now. Many of the protesters were not violent nor willing to become violent, but that doesn't mean that some weren't and aren't. So the protests at Evergreen became riots, just like the protests on the streets of America have become riots, and they need to be stopped. You shouldn't be negotiating with rioters and let them do their thing. At the point that the president of the college stood down the police chief, as was his right because it was a campus police force. And she told us that we were not safe on campus and we were not safe on our bicycles anywhere in town. And
Oh my gosh.
and that they were
Wow.
searching car to car for someone they would not name, but that she thought was Brett. That was before
Wow.
we left. Later, some of them armed themselves proudly with baseball bats and started doing what they were calling community justice. And we lived very close to campus and they knew where we lived. So we left.
Yeah.
I was, for weeks, we would look at each other, Brett and I, and say, cannot believe that this isn't being shut down yet. Cannot believe that someone, some adult is not looking at the situation and saying, enough is enough. You are actually children. You are acting like children. You were sent here by adult activists who had no right to do so, and stop it immediately. Instead, as we've seen in other campus incidents like this, one of the leaders of the protest was given a job paid by the college, which means paid by the state of Washington, that summer to help rewrite the students' conduct code. So it was, heads were tails, tails were heads.
Yeah. My goodness, that sounds terrifying. And it's crazy to think that, like, protests have always existed on campuses. And we have a long tradition of that. There are people who say what's happening right now isn't new. I don't know what your perspective on that is, but just that, like, this is unrest is all, that's part of campus culture. But it does seem like the fact that you had to flee the state is, I mean, if nothing else, I'm curious. So at least in my circle of friends, I know a lot of people in all sides of the political spectrum, but one trend I've noticed recently is that a lot of folks who started off moderate or like a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right have been radicalized by experiences, not of course most as extreme as you're describing, but by different kinds of silencing. And I'm just curious if you, and that, how could you not be, right, by an experience like that? I'm curious whether that rings true for you, if you feel like you have been radicalized by that, or just that you have been given access to, like, how do you think about that? How has it changed you in terms of what you see when you look at America?
There are a tremendous number of ways to answer that. Of course, it's a great question. I think I understand better the rhetoric from the right now, which I didn't really have access to before. Or obviously, I had access, but I didn't pursue it often, right? And I am of the left. I'm still of the left. And people have asked me, why? How could you possibly be? And what I say in response to that is that it's not a social position. It doesn't have to do with my friends, because I have friends, and I always have, on the left, on the right, in the center. It is about my fundamental belief that we still have problems that need to be fixed in the country, and that some of those will require collective action. Like that's in a nutshell the thing that places me on the left. And I don't think that anything about that has changed. But what we saw as Evergreen broke down, fell apart, imploded, was, well, one thing that Brett has said is that it revealed the character of everyone involved. We had many people whom we thought were friends who proved to be turncoats. I had many people who I still consider friends who privately supported us but were scared to say anything publicly. And if all of them had stood up to the mob, the outcome would have been very, very different. And we had people who we had no affiliation with prior at all, who stood up for the values that we were standing up for truth and against actual racism, and for equality and justice for all. And we became aware of pockets of sort of truth and humility on campus that we didn't even know were there. And of course, that was true across the wider world as well. So, we immediately had people from across the political spectrum, both very, very well known and completely anonymous, approaching us to say, thank you. You have a friend in Texas, you have a friend in Poland, you have a friend in DC. I'm on the left, I'm on the right, I'm in the center, I'm old, I'm young, I'm Black, I'm white, I'm rich, I'm poor. All of these demographics were represented in the people who came to us and said, thank you. This kind of ideology, this rhetoric that doesn't allow dissent, is scaring me. Some people have now said to us, I recognize this from my time in Venezuela. I recognize this from my time in Czechoslovakia. I recognize this. And that will sound, if you're just if you're not thinking too carefully about the ideas, but just thinking about the people who have said things, you might then categorize me, who says that, as therefore on the right. But you know, I'm not, and it's not because I don't have friends on the right. I do. It is that I think actually these categories mean less than they used to, and we usually don't even agree on exactly what we mean when we say them. But what I said before about, you know, feeling that there's more progress to be made and that some of the problems that society faces require collective action, that's the thing that puts me on the left. And then you know, and also some social issues. But I certainly, you know, when I say, for instance, that I have as one of my core values loyalty, that is a value that tends to be associated with people on the right. I'm also you know, very open to experience and sort of adventure seeking, which is a value that tends to be associated with people on the left. So you know, probably a mix of some things on, you know, fairly wide on both sides, but really not interested anymore in being categorized by other people as you're on the left or you're on the right, and therefore I know what to think of what else you think.
Right. I know what to, and who you are, and
who
what
you
your
are.
character's like, and what you, what the things that you say mean, how you're using words, all those things. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting and under the media somehow elides this narrative all the time. And I say this as somebody who used to work in the media. I try to criticize the media accurately because it receives so much just buffeting from all directions. But I do think that there is a stereotyping that is inaccurate with regard to the idea that Americans are categorizable in the way that they seem. Yeah. And the thing that you just said, that you have some, you know, some tendencies in this direction, some tendencies in that direction, like that is how Americans actually are, right? Is heterodox. And I think that that's something we may get into a little bit later, because but I think that makes all the sense in the world to me. I'm curious. So I have thought for a while, right before the 2016 election, you know, one reads all these articles, and many of the articles I read suggested that actually the dynamic that you're talking about on college campuses is much more central to the rise of our current president and to the sort of the heat and the passion of his supporters than people realize. And I have begun to believe that actually campus culture and the dynamics of on the one side fighting for social justice, on the other side, and simultaneously doing some silencing, and then the reaction against silencing is actually very instrumental. And that a lot of folks on the right are sort of saying, I may not be acceptable to you, but I am who I am, and I'm a citizen, and that's going to have to work for you because I get a vote just as valid as yours. And I'm interested, you said that you better hear and understand the rhetoric on the right. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, or tell me a little bit more about what that means, what you meant by that?
Let me go back to where you began the question, which is this idea that, and I've read some of this analysis too, that ascribes or that points to the unrest on college campuses as being a product of the rise of Trump and Trump-like thinking, I think. And I've read this. I don't think it's true. I think Trump and Trump's election was an easy excuse to prompt more and more easy campus meltdown. Just as now, anytime any killing happens on the streets in which a white cop is going after a black man, this is an easy excuse, whether or not the story is actually what it seems. So there was a pump that had been primed and was waiting for an event, and Trump proved to be that event. And so, you know, you had protest after protest after protest right after the election, including on the Evergreen campus. But you also had, well, here's a story, and I think I've told this publicly once before, but the first time that I met with my class, so this was it was the 16-17 year was the last year that I was a college professor. And in fact, fall of 2016 was the last year that I was actively in the classroom because I was on sabbatical after that. So the first time I met my class was actually a few days after the election in November 2016.
Oh.
And it was my co-faculty who was teaching, who was actively in front of the class that day. We had a full day. She was giving a lecture in the morning, and we had lab in the afternoon. And she walked into the classroom, as did I, and there was so this was a very, very liberal college, very liberal campus, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone, including myself, had this sort of slack-jawed, glazed eyes, like, oh my God, what just happened to us? Look, as you know,
Yeah.
I think anyone who was in any kind of liberal enclave will remember those few days
Right.
after after Trump's election. We could not believe it,
Mm-hmm.
and that was definitely the mood in the room. And my faculty colleague just didn't mention it and just embarked on a lecture about horse evolution. And I remember looking around the
Right.
room and going, I actually care more about horse evolution than most people, but I
Indeed.
I don't think anyone is all that able to totally attend to this right now.
Yeah.
And she happened to end a little bit early. And before she sort of released them, I said, anyone who wants to stay, this is no longer part of class. It was a vertebrate evolution program. This is no longer part of class, but anyone who wants to stay, I would be happy to lead a conversation about the election and how people are feeling, and just, let's talk. And I think it was about 40 out of our 50 students stayed all the way through their lunch hour. We walked from that room to the lab that we were doing that afternoon. And so, we spent over an hour talking. And one of the things that I began by giving a little 5-minute soliloquy, in which I said, for those of you who think that racists elected Trump, you're wrong. Half of the country isn't racist. That's not who we are. And I said, given that we're on the Evergreen campus and you guys, the 40 of you, chose to stay in this room to talk about this, probably there's not a single Trump supporter in this room right now. And so you might imagine it would be really easy for me to speak in a way that, denigrates both him and the people who supported him, but that's not going to be how we heal our country and how we move forward. And I showed a little video from Jonathan Pye, in which he was ranting about Trump. He's British. He's a British comic. It's his stage name. And he basically said, what happened here in London, in England, with Brexit has now happened to you guys. And of course you did, because you have slandered half of your populace. You have told half the populace that they're deplorables. And of course they are not going to respect you and, and come around to your point of view when what you're doing is saying you people are morons and you're racist and you're sexist and you're awful, and please vote for our guy or our woman in that case. Like, of course they're not going to. So, I also said, think carefully about, this is to my students in November of 2016, after the election of Trump. I said, think about how often you may have felt like you could not say an opinion that you had among friends or on campus. And again, I said this to a group of people that I imagined to be pretty far left, and indeed they were. Said, if people on the left are feeling that they cannot voice their opinions, then imagine what anyone in the center or the right is feeling. And I literally had 3 students come up to me later in tears with stories about, one of them had lost a job on campus for having a mildly out of line opinion with the social justice movement on campus. Another one, and it was an independent data point, had a friend who had lost a job, and another one was losing friends, was losing her friend group. And it was all women, and they were heartbroken. They could not figure out how their staunch liberal, pro-equality, pro-diversity, pro-justice, pro-freedom views could possibly have gotten them into this kind of trouble on a campus that was supposed to also be for all of those things. So that, I'm not sure, I think I circled around. I'm not sure I really answered your question, but maybe if you want to rephrase part of it that I didn't get to.
No, you did. It's about the experience. I think that, it's about the experience of being silenced, either explicitly or implicitly. And just to say this, I think that, just to preempt an argument that I can hear already in the minds of possibly some listeners, I think that a common leftist response on this subject is, or social justice oriented response on this subject is that people of color, women, others have been, marginalized communities have been silenced for generations. And I think that's also true.
Yes.
It's just that sometimes tactics are bad, right? Sometimes a means is bad in and of itself. And,
Yeah.
The students who came to you experienced, I'm not even going to say the same, but they experienced something that is bitter and socially harmful.
Yes.
And it's just, that does something to people. And you can say that they are people who deserve it because of their status in society, although I think that's a hard argument to make when you're actually looking at somebody face to face.
Yeah. No, it's, and frankly, I think it's actually a racist or sexist or, you know, put in your demographic, whatever ist argument itself, that if we are going to conflate individuals with the populations that they are part of and say, you are responsible for the sins of your forefathers or your entire group, then that feels to me like the end of democracy. Like, you know, how is it that we are going to live and, as you say, look each other in the eyes and see each other's humanity? And you know, it absolutely there are groups who can be identified with, you know, demographic markers who have suffered greater oppression than others in society. We know this is true, and there is still ongoing racism and sexism in all of this. This is absolutely true. I have come, and you know, this I believed before Evergreen blew up on me, but I have come to believe and have said many times that if this movement was totally good faith and was actually seeking equality, then I would feel very differently about it, even if sometimes the tactics seem to me out of step with their stated goals. But there is a lot of evidence across, you know, between videos and the websites of the organizations involved and interviews with people who are saying that they're representing what the goals are, that suggests that it's not equality they're after. It's about turning the tables of oppression. If you are a member of a group that's historically benefited, which is to say, you know, specifically, you know, let's just target the group, you know, straight white men, then there is no way that you should be able to live in an equal society now, because the people in the past who looked like you got so much benefit from society that we don't need to think about justice for you now. Well, that's not democratic. That's not a society I have any interest in living in, even though, yes, it is true that there has been certainly a lot of moments in history when it is exactly that demographic who has wielded power, and individuals in that demographic have done so unfairly and brutally and violently, and that's, you know, that can all be true without arguing that therefore people today are either, you know, people today representing that demographic are either inherently brutal or violent, or deciding that they shouldn't have the rights that everyone should have across society.
Absolutely. I think that, yeah, you have also just been exposed to some of the most noxious and extreme versions of this that and that is, that's affecting, right? Like no one is the same after that.
That's right.
I want to push a little bit on, there's a thing that, I'd like to, so I run a debate program, and so I'm trying to figure out like what are the best principles for discourse, partly because some of them, and you know, other people have done this, but some of them are a little bit subtle. And so one of them is, let's take the opponent's best argument, not their worst argument. And so I want to sort of take a slightly more moderate, I'm just going to take a second to lay this out. So I'd like your response to, so we agree, right, that racism, sexism, all that still exists. We also agree that characterizing every cisgender white male as the enemy or the oppressor is at minimum counterproductive. I would actually say dehumanizing for the same reason that you did, because it erases their individual, the unique soul that lives in that body. But I'm curious, so it seems like the history of civil rights and that various groups have pursued is generally about legislation. It's generally about changing laws and rules. And that is good, but it only takes you so far, because it doesn't, the battle to change a statute doesn't usually change the hearts of the people on the other side. And so then we have societies that have better rules, or a society that has better rules, but all the same people who have, if anything, been alienated by the way the fight was conducted. And it seems like on a lot of the places, so when I look at, I agree with you, obviously, racism and sexism and all that still exist. And when I try to identify it, I think that one of the things I disagree, so I'm going to actually just take 1 second and explain where I come at this issue from, because I think it'll help make sense of the question I'm about to ask you. So I am fascinated by campus politics and that whole culture. And that's because I come from, first, I'm somebody who identifies both as conservative and feminist, and because I come from a tradition of real free thought. From my family all the way through like high school, college, I believe deeply in free thought. And my primary volunteer activity is as a counselor on a sexual assault hotline. And so I have some relatively immediate encounter with, I think, the sources of some of the, frankly, I might even say just, right, trauma and the strong emotions, I would say, violent and frankly often justified emotions of rage and desire for society to change regardless of what that bloody costs, right? Like, and now, not in 50 years when the dominant class agrees, all that. And so I've been fascinated with this because I feel like I really do, my heart really is in both places. And so I want to ask you, and one more key piece, I think that racism and sexism and all that live in culture these days. They don't live in statutes. I think that people on college campuses are often trying to get the administration to rule this or that, but that what actually needs to change is culture. And my question for you is basically, how would you advise that people pursue social justice, given that the changes that are needed are not primarily, I mean, yes, there are bad laws. Some of those need changing too, but are more, the racism and the sexism hide in interactions. They hide in assumptions people make. They hide in what we think of as normal, right? So they hide in all these places. How do you go about disrupting that, fighting that, somehow struggling for rapid change in a productive way?
Yeah, what a great question. So I think you're asking, in part, sort of how do individuals change the minds and the feelings of the other individuals they meet, as opposed to sort of systems level change. And I think, at risk of sounding like I know more than I do, I think I was doing this in the classroom for 15 years. And, my classrooms were never explicitly political. I did, I had this interchange that I told you about. And, I did field work with students, and we would sit around campfires until late at night talking about all manner of things. But the actual work that we were doing that was curricular it wasn't poli-sci, right? It was evolutionary biology, which did include human evolution and the history of human behaviors, including things like racism and sexism and genocide and rape and all of these things. So we did get into trying to explain while never justifying these things. So I think that is why I'm going here, which is that first, interacting with everyone as if they are a real human being on the other side of the interaction. They neither share all of your beliefs, nor, if they don't share all of your beliefs, are they an alien life form who simply needs to be ignored or beaten down, right?
Yeah.
And approaching every interaction with a grace and a generosity of spirit that says, I may not agree, I hope to learn something, I hope to make a connection here. And even if it's just a connection between another human being, and you walk away both otherwise unchanged in your views, but you felt a connection. I mean, I feel like, especially now, we're talking at the end of August 2020, most of us have been in some kind of lockdown for 6 months. Most of us have, I think everyone has somewhat reduced, and many of us have highly reduced social interactions for half a year now. Of all moments that it should be easy to say, what about the value of simple human connection in any interaction, rather than having this really stark view of good versus evil. I've called it the comic bookification of American beliefs, that everyone imagines they're the superhero, they would be the ones standing up to the Nazis, and that those who aren't are the supervillains and need to be abolished immediately. And superheroes and supervillains are actually incredibly rare. You know, true evil and true evil is really rare. I think that actually true goodness, which isn't the kind of starkness that true evil would be, is actually really, really common. Is actually really common, and that most of us, vast majority of us, have some of that, and we're all flawed. And so, engaging people with grace and generosity, and using narrative. And, you know, I say this as a scientist, using narrative, like individual stories, to say, you know, that thing you said about, not, you know, if you ever get married, not thinking your wife should work or something, right? Like that's I would necessarily hear a lot these days, but I know some people still do have these beliefs. You know, let me tell you why. You know, if that had been imposed on me, I would be living a much more impoverished life, and it feels like an anti-democratic sentiment. And you know, could we talk about it? So, as opposed to, how could you possibly think that, given that you think that I know the other 8 things that you think that I also hate? Right. 9 things, I therefore hate you. And I'm now cataloging you with all these other people who we know the names of, and we know we hate them. And, you know, it's about creating a good kind of rhetoric that is in no way based on ideology, that, you know, it doesn't accept a slate of beliefs. If you believe item A, you believe B through Z. No, if you believe item A, maybe you're a little bit more likely to believe B and a little bit more likely to believe C, but also it's quite possible that if you're talking to a free thinker, as you said, right? If you're talking to a free thinker, there's a really good chance that what the person has done is said, well, there's a whole bunch of things that I actually just haven't given much thought to. So we can talk, but I really don't have an opinion yet, and that's okay. And then there's other things about which I do have opinions, and yes, you know, in my case, they're more like my beliefs are more likely to fall in line with a liberal slate, but not all of them, right? Like it's because I don't let some organization in DC decide my opinions for me, right? Like I want to do it by first principles, and let us allow all of each other to come to our beliefs from first principles, and just provide enough information, including not just facts and statistics and analysis, but also narrative, to hone your beliefs in light of incoming information. And I guess one more thing, also allow people to change their minds. To have said 2 years ago, I never would have voted for X, and to say now, well, I'm thinking about it because I see now that what I thought about X isn't actually the full story.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful articulation of lots of different pieces of what it can mean when you're face to face with someone. I especially loved your comment that that you might learn something, that like just having the ability to, I also think that allowing people to change their minds is a kind of grace, right? It accepts that, that we are fallible and can make mistakes and can improve over our lifespan. And good Lord, I hope that's true because otherwise we're all sunk. I
feel like I was just saying the other day to someone, like, I don't understand this idea that many people feel very comfortable saying people never change. Like, where did that come from? And why are we so comfortable saying it? If we know that childhood and adolescence is explicitly a time of change. And what kind of sort of weird misunderstanding of humanity is it that says, at some point, call it 18 or 22 or 25 or whatever, now you're there and you don't change. And do we change less? Are we less labile over time? Probably. But we're still changing. We're still hoping to meet new people and meet new ideas, and the world around us is changing. So of course we ourselves will also change.
Absolutely. I think what people mean by that is people don't change as fast as I want them to, or in the way that I want them
to.
That's
right. I think that's right.
So I'm gonna now I want to now take that to a societal level. So we've been talking about like individually, and I want to try to put forward what I think is, to my mind, one of the better cases for the social justice, I don't know, I guess one term for it is social justice warrior, social justice activist way of approaching these issues, and just see what you think. And I'm going to stay on women's issues. Actually, before I do that, I'm just curious, do you consider yourself a feminist? Like, how do you relate to that word?
Yeah, I always did.
Yeah.
I did as a child, and I grew up. I'm 51, so I grew up in the
Uh-huh.
70s and 80s, and it was a really easy time to be a girl in a lot of ways. It was a
Uh-huh.
totally empowering time to get rid of the gender norms that were actually restrictive, and to still
Hmm.
just celebrate being a girl. Knowing that at some point
Totally.
I would become a woman, and uh, obviously there are compromises that you make if you want to, for instance, have a career and be a mother, and I've done both. But
Hmm.
and that's not because patriarchy. That's because actually just
It's hard to
age
do both.
adaptation. Yeah, it's just hard to do both, and
Hmm.
it's because biology. It's not
Hmm.
it's not
Hmm.
imposed in not to say that some of the manifestations haven't been imposed by men on women to control women, but
Hmm.
the more fundamental truth is not that.
Hmm.
So I guess second wave feminism, I'm totally on board. And then third
Hmm.
wave feminism starts to look mean and counterproductive and biology denying.
Hmm.
And I think the first moment that I really had that sense, actually, I couldn't quite put a year to it. Sometime in the late 90s, I was in graduate
Hmm.
school, and three of my female friends in graduate school, you were all getting PhDs in biology, went to a live event with Gloria Steinem.
Hmm.
And you were all fans. I had been an early subscriber to the ad-free Ms. magazine. I loved this stuff.
Hmm.
And at this talk that she gave, it was a big auditorium. It wasn't an intimate gathering, of course, but at this talk, she said, and I don't remember exactly the words, but she said something to the effect of, biology is misogynist, and therefore we have to fight biology. Right,
Ah,
right.
so
And
the biologist is like, hmm.
yeah, and my three friends and I walked out of there going, oh, like, why go there? Why go
Yeah.
into a territory that is simply reality denying? And
Mm.
we can observe what is true, what we've been handed by billions of years of evolution, and
Hmm.
recognize what can be changed of the current social norms and social
Hmm.
mores, and
Hmm.
also recognize what's not going to change. And if we start pretending that black is white and white is black, we're not going to get anywhere, and we're just going to lose people like me, who
Mm.
like, actually then your brand of feminism, this kind of third wave feminism, not for me, because it's no longer coherent.
Mm.
So
Mm. Hmm.
yes and no is the
Yes and
answer.
no, and
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Facebook is complicated. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I respect a lot of what you've said there, and I think that I rarely meet a woman who like, or man, actually men are more likely to be like, I'm just a feminist. I'm
Yeah.
and not to try to make it specific. Women are often like, well, I like this part, I don't like that part. I
Yeah. Yeah.
my personal relationship with this word is that I want to take it back. I think that
Yeah.
I support it as, I believe feminist means pro woman, and or that's how I define it anyway. And the question of what exactly that means, that's where all the debate is, and that's an excellent question. We should all
Yes.
talk about that. But like, being specifically pro woman, and I don't mean, and that is different from neutrality, right? That's different
Hmm.
from just being pro people.
Yep.
It's specifically in favor of lifting up women and supporting their nature and their aspirations and all of that. And
As
so,
different from men, right? Like
right, right.
without women needing to act like men in order to
Hmm.
make it in a world that has been traditionally male but isn't inherently now a male domain. So women should be able to,
Absolutely.
for instance, make it in finance without simply acting like men, whatever exactly
Just
that might mean. Yeah.
precisely. Yes,
Mhm.
precisely. And I also think that it's very, very, I mean, I think it's a fool's errand actually to try to define in like simple words what like masculinity and femininity are.
Yeah.
But I think that there is deep wisdom in femininity and real strengths that do not come, that like are just, that it is a real thing, and that society, I actually think that um, there is that one of the interesting things that's happening in society intellectually right now is that disciplines that were more often, that are more sort of feminine in traditional terms, like psychology and sort of the language of trauma and all of that, are on the rise, partly because women are on the rise, and that's going to lead to it. Presently it's really disruptive,
Right.
but it will eventually lead to a better society, I hope, if we can get through the disruption. So on the subject, on this sort of general, that's great. I thank you for explaining that. And like, I bet a lot of people listening to this podcast really resonate with what you said there, because I know that a lot of folks have gone through that journey. So I want to ask about, like I said, sort of give you a play devil's advocate, although again, like I said, for me, my heart is in both places, free thought and social justice. And of course, you are also supportive of social justice.
Right.
I just mean, let me try to give you what I think the best argument is for the other side. So it seems to me that if sexism lives in assumptions and in social norms and in habits of behavior and habits of thought that are mostly invisible to people who don't experience the negative side of them, then in order to, if you really want to change society fast, and I'll just use the topic of sexual violence. So the statistics are disputed, but whether it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 10, I don't think it matters a lot. Women will experience sexual assault at some point in their lives, most often when they're young adults, although not, there's a, it extends across the whole lifespan, all socioeconomic strata and all of that, right? Like this is a problem for everyone. Also, of course, women are not the only ones to experience sexual violence. And I think that there is good reason to believe that it's, society has a long way to go for men, longer around that issue than for women. But in any case, the state is has ostensibly been established to prevent violence, right? Or to have a monopoly on violence. But there are only some kinds of violence, you've probably recognized some of this argument, that we care about. And intimate partner violence it's not that we don't, of course, no one would say they don't care, and yet our society is not set up in such a way that preventing it is a deep priority, because if it were, we would have different practices and social norms and things that would allow us to prevent it. And also we would have a justice system that would, I think, adjudicate these claims better. And I don't mean, by the way, that we would use lower standards of evidence or that sort of thing, right. But that this particular kind of crime is very poorly suited to our methods of justice now. So lots of violence of this particular variety that affects a particular group of people, women mostly, yep. And is supported by a system of assumptions that allow perpetrators to get away with it, right? So, and I, by the way, on my conservative side, I would also say that, like, maybe single-sex dorms aren't such a bad idea, and like there are some other things, that structural things that one could do. But culturally, the typical one is like, oh, she was asking for it because she was dressed a certain way, or that the first reaction when a sexual assault survivor tells you her story should be to question her, right? To say, is that true? As opposed to having a variety of other reactions. And so I guess my question is basically, if these things live in culture, and it's going to take 50 years for us to change the mind of and sort of enlighten and raise consciousness for every member of the dominant class, isn't the best option to do socially disruptive things, right? Like to sort of enforce social norms using things like shame and guilt. Like, how else would we get there? And it is, I do resonate, as I would imagine you do and many others do, with the idea that, like, we can't wait that long. Like, right. This is an immediate and very urgent problem now, and this just can't be allowed to continue. And I just can see how that leads people to silencing tactics and that sort of thing. Yeah. And I guess I would ask, like, what other option is there? Like, what better, like, what would you have people do? And how do you, can you really blame them, I guess?
So the answer to the last one is yes.
Okay.
Except, I can and I do, with the giant caveat that I think we've created a whole generation, we society have created a whole generation of people who are less able to understand and modulate their own moods and emotions and just psychologies in general than generations before them. And this is something I've talked about a lot before, but just in very brief. So just to the last tiny bit of your question before I try to get to some of the earlier stuff, there's a sort of perfect storm of a generation raised with helicopter or snowplow parents who don't let them experience risk, and who are effectively disembodied, many of whom were on mood-altering drugs. In the case of girls, it's very often anti-anxiety or antidepressant meds. In the case of boys, it's often ADHD meds. So it's, we have a generation of boys on speed and girls on Prozac. And then we have also people raised screens so that they're interacting almost entirely, not almost entirely, well, for the last 6 months, almost entirely, but so much more through this interface that allows people to very quickly say things that maybe they would never, ever, ever say to someone's face. And so you have, I think that has created really a giant mental health crisis for perhaps an entire generation. And I say this, actually, I don't know how old you are. I'm going to assume you're a millennial.
I am.
Okay.
I'm 33. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yep. So I happened to teach such that basically my entire teaching tenure between 2002 and 2017 was millennials. And I loved my students. I'm in touch with many of them still. Many of them are my friends. And so I don't say this never having met a millennial or not having friends who are millennials, right?
I heard, by the way, that you were the most popular professor on campus at Evergreen, and that made it even more bittersweet to leave. Just anyway, got to give you props for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I loved the work. Actually, it was really remarkable, and it was a combination of the model that Evergreen allowed and the students, and that's what it was, right? They were amazing. But one thing I saw, for instance, because I ran field trips a lot, and whenever I did field trips, I had to take health histories so that if something happened, I had these sheets in the field, right? And starting in 2006-07, I started to see by probably 2012-13, almost half of my class often was on or had been on some mood altering prescription for some developmentally important period of their life. And I thought, oh my God, like what? This is malpractice at best, but it's society level malpractice, just like some of the stuff that's happening, sort of society level child abuse. So I blame them, but that's a giant caveat that actually we societally are responsible for having really, really messed up. And I don't know the solution to that for people who are now adults and unable to face risk because they never experienced it before, don't know what to do when they have free time besides look at their screens, feel totally dissociated from their bodies because they've never done anything physically real in the universe, like, sports or carpentry or cooking, like just something where you get like a manifestation of your physical work that you did with your hands that you can't, like, if it's just take cooking, so just take, the most female typically gendered of the
right
I just listed, like if the cake comes out of the oven and it's flat and burnt to a crisp and no one will eat it, you can't negotiate with your friends that actually it's a good cake.
Not subjective.
No, it's not.
Generally not.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there's like a sliding scale with that. And, similar, like if you made
Some
a table,
people like charred cake. Yes.
if you made a table and it was trying to be a dining room table and now it's 2 inches tall, no, you failed, right? Like you just failed. So, really reintroducing work and skills and tasks and hobbies that provide a physical corrective from the universe of like, did you do it or did you not, would actually help. So that is all a long-winded explanation for, do I blame them? Yes, but also no at this bigger level. So to get to the bigger part of your question, which was sort of, how can we use, is it legitimate, if I heard you right, is it legitimate to use shame and guilt? Did you say shame and guilt, shame and fear?
Personally, I actually think shame and guilt, that we should use guilt but not shame, but that's a
okay.
tangent. So shame and silencing, sure.
Shame and silencing, given that nicer tactics seem to work very slowly, if at all, and many of us view the current situation as there isn't enough time. Right?
Unacceptable.
We don't have enough time. And it's interesting what you just said about shame but not guilt. That's the distinction you made, right? You think shame but not guilt, and at first pass I'd never thought of that, parsing that out like that before, but I may well agree with you there. I don't. This movement seems to have come in with so much associated stuff that you're not allowed to pick and choose, that I have that if you're telling me I get to pick and choose some of the tactics and absolutely 100% reject others, then yes. Are some of the tactics being used legitimate? Yes. I think, I don't know what the actual origin of Me Too was. I know it went bad. Like it went bad and it was nothing that I ended up wanting to have anything to do with. But at first I thought, this looks like a much needed corrective, because the fact is that the vast majority of women have experienced something that they
Mhm.
should not have had to experience, and that is true at the same from some men, at the same time as I also believe it to be true that the vast majority of men have never behaved in an
Right.
inappropriate way to women. And so, of course, the vast majority of of men watching this movement would just be flabbergasted. We're like, what are you
Mhm.
talking about? And
Mhm.
so sharing the stories and saying, no,
Mhm.
actually, yes, we like, I did and
This
you
is
did and she
everywhere.
did. This is
Mhm.
everywhere. And, little workplace things that aren't quite what anything a man would ever experience. All you good guys, you need to know that. You should know that.
Yeah.
And you should want to know that, and know you shouldn't sit silently while I yell at you about it. Like
Mhm.
you shouldn't be forced to do that. I shouldn't expect you to want to do that. But if you say that you are interested in a fair and equal society moving forward, we can
Right.
recognize our differences. We can recognize that it will always be different to walk around the world, male versus female, and that
Mhm.
it will always be different making a decision to go outside at night alone as a woman versus a man, for
Yep.
instance. And I say that as someone who has traveled alone in many parts of the world where many people would not, man or woman.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
I have
Mhm.
a particular relationship with risk, and the thing that I say on this topic is you have to be both smart and lucky. And
Mhm.
I happen to have been both smart and lucky, but
Mhm.
very smart women have not been lucky. And
Yep.
some people who didn't behave correctly got lucky. And
Mhm.
none of that changes the fact that you have to be both smart and lucky as a young woman in particular
Mhm.
to take any risks in society at all and be totally free of unwanted attention from
Mhm.
men.
Mhm.
It's also true, of course, that, what do you qualify as unwanted attention? What some courtship,
Yeah.
legitimate courtship you can say, well, I wasn't interested in him, therefore it was unwanted. Well, but isn't he allowed to try, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and for me, I say like words, but never hands. Like
Mhm.
you never get to touch unwanted, but you can say a lot of things and just go away, leave me alone, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
but it's a different situation if it's the workplace. Like
Mhm.
no sexual quid pro quo in the workplace. Can we agree to that? Like, come on, right?
Yes.
And you and I can say that, and roughly half your audience, if you have an equal sex ratio audience, might have thought before, 3 years ago, what is she talking about? Of course,
Right.
right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sharing stories is actually super powerful, and not
Mhm.
sharing stories in a way that says, sit down and shut up. I've taken too much from men, and now you need to, now you need to listen. No, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
Also, not all men, and I know that's got a
Of
crazy,
course.
reputation now. It's it's just not. In fact, not only not all men, not most men, just
Mhm.
not most men. So it is. Is this a little unfair? Maybe, but is it our responsibility to inform and to educate about what it actually has looked like and felt like in workplaces, without accusing either explicitly or implicitly the very many men who are out there who would never do such a thing of somehow being complicit? Because I
Mhm.
don't think not knowing is complicit, is a kind of complicitness. I
Mhm.
don't agree with that.
Mhm. Yeah, so I have often thought I really agree with your point about most men in the sense that um so there everything around sexual assault statistics is disputed because it's a very hard thing to gather data on, but the best evidence I have read suggests that most assaults are perpetrated by repeat offenders who usually have a high number of offenses, and so this is not like men. It
Right.
is a small number of predatory people, which means that we should,
Mhm.
and the worst thing we could do in that situation is what we do often, which is um, talk about it in such a way that all those good men end up feeling attacked and identifying with the accused in that sort of circumstance rather than with the I'll use the word victim in this context.
Yep.
And I know so many men with good hearts who have been well, who need who both would never do such a thing and who are ignorant of it. And
Right. Right.
it depends, I think, how you look at ignorant. Is it ignorance rather? Is it an innocent thing? I think it usually is.
Mhm.
And it's also the case, though, on the other side that, and I want to switch topics in a second to go towards something a little more hopeful. But um, on the other side, it is the case that looking the other way with this stuff, because that's how you've been raised, is
Mm-hmm.
part of the problem. And
This
so
is true.
I wonder what you think about, so I mentioned guilt and shame. I
Mm-hmm.
think that we should have, this is going to sound super like, I don't know, Catholic or Jewish, or I'm a person of faith, but I'm not either of those things. Anyway, guilt culture, I think, would be great compared to the, so in my view, shame says you are bad. Guilt says that thing you did was bad. And I wonder what you think about a culture that could say that thing you did was bad, but we still accept you and we're calling you to something higher now that you have this new information. And I wonder what you would think. I think that's delicate because partly because we have so few, like the words sexist and racist and all that carry just a huge load of shame, and we just need better words for those things, but or a spectrum of words rather. But yeah, what do you think about like guilt culture, no shame culture?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And your framing, I had never thought to think about guilt versus shame as guilt is the thing you did, but not the thing the person did, but not the person, is something that we need to point out and not approve of. Shame being the thing that the person did is something we don't approve of, and therefore we also don't approve of the person. So that's what I heard you say, and I think that's an incredibly powerful framing. And given that framing, and so I know that one of the things that is causing some of the problems is that people are arguing and they haven't agreed on terms, right? So like.
Yes.
Given what you just said about guilt and shame, and I sort of repeated it back to you, and you said that is what you had said, then I agree with your conclusion. And I think also, this is, so the evolutionary biologist in me says, okay, just like you said, Catholicism, Judaism, many other traditions have used guilt as a way, as a tactic to get people to behave in ways that the faith expected people to behave. And that has been useful. That has absolutely been useful. And it may be just that I'm ignorant, but I think that shame is a much less widely used tactic at a large scale. And my guess would be, for two reasons. My hopeful guess would be that that's for two reasons. It's not as effective and it's not as nice. Right. And so, both of those things. And of course, those are tied up in each other. Mean tactics don't tend to be effective. And so, long term.
Not in the long term.
Right.
They're effective in the short term.
At the moment, we're seeing it very, very effective. But I think, part of what I hear you saying in this conversation is, April, am really in favor of many of the stated goals of some of the social justice people, but I can't see how they're getting there, right? And this is like I believe that they are pushing people to the right. That this is
they definitely are. I don't know if there are studies on that, but it is just anyway. Yes.
Well, exactly. Happening. And you say this in some circles. They're like, oh no, they're revealing the problems with the conservatives. No, actually, they're 100% pushing people to the right, which is going to make it harder to affect the actual change that we are saying that we would like to see.
Want. Yeah. Which is tragic. It's sort of like, I sort of see it as the Malcolm X side of the movement is working, and the MLK side of the movement is too weak. So I want to thank you for being willing to get into that a little bit with me. I rarely run across people who are sufficiently aligned to like really get into that.
It's fun.
I'd like to just note, so your work and ours are both, as we were saying, around helping people interact in a way that is ultimately humanizing, right? That doesn't stereotype, doesn't make assumptions, does hold people accountable, because I think both of us are okay with that insofar as we're talking about guilt and changing behaviors. So does do that and is authentic, right? Like where people actually say what they think, where that is like something that can be heard, and relationships, relationships can withstand that, but I actually think that the real goal is when relationships can be built through that and on top of that. And I'm interested in just some of the hopeful signs that you see and where you see that space going, like how Braver Angels, like a lot of organizations, is working on just, bringing in different people who are working on this from different angles. And like, I think that there really is a movement here some would call it a counter movement. I actually think it's a movement in its own right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just interested in, how you look at that and what you think it could do and what that would look like over time.
Well, I think, right now, at the end of August 2020, it's easy to be hopeless. It's very
Yeah, that's true.
hopeless. And, I dread the morning of November 4th, no matter what happens at the polls the day before. That said, what you guys are doing at Braver Angels, and what a lot of people are increasingly willing to stand up and say, does give me hope. And I do think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the Hidden Tribes report from a couple of years ago, right, that reveals, I think, more accurately than any other polls that I've seen, not just what people will tell pollsters and then do something else actually at the polls or in their private lives, but reveals the vast majority of us actually really do share values. And it's just these fringe, like, I don't remember, it's something like 4% on the extreme right and like 8 or 9% on the extreme left, who actually have these sort of authoritarian, do or die, it's my way or the highway, and are really actually acting out some diabolical fantasies. The vast majority of the rest of us, while we will disagree on particular social issues and on the state of society as it is today and how much more needs to change before we're where we can all feel like we're living in a totally free and fair society, that's the classic distinction between left and right, between Democrats and Republicans. Those of us who are in that vast middle are beginning to find each other. I feel certain that we're beginning to find each other. I don't know, over the polarization that frankly the two parties are trying to cause us to continue to just like not speak to one another at all. It's hard for me to know, even predict how hopeful I could be until at least after this election cycle. And I think we need real change at the political level on the part of the DNC and the RNC. Like neither of them speak for me at this point. And I've been a lifelong Democrat. I've always voted blue, and I just am certain that neither of them speak for me at this point. So I know that people are finding each other, and that right now people are feeling scared. Especially right now. First COVID, and then the protests that became riots that put so many people, small businesses out of business and such, are feeling hopeless, and now they're losing friends because the polarization is deepening. But there are voices. There are ever more voices who are, doing what we're doing right here and being public and saying, actually, you can be a good and honorable person and disagree with me, and I'm still going to see you as human. And this is what we need going forward, because guess what? We do still have problems that we need to solve. And we also want to live together and go back to a world at some level that allows us to, drink together and enjoy art together and go play Frisbee together and, do a number of things together and apart and make our own choices about who to be with without being told, you must think this or else you have to leave.
Absolutely. And I think that just in this conversation, one of the things that you said something really beautiful that I want to, I might go back and listen to it and like write it down. Just your description of what it means to be, because it's really about, in some ways, the big dynamics of the moment are tearing apart individual in-person relationships, and that's the travesty, because those are also some of the biggest sources of meaning in life, right? And so the way that you articulated what it looks like to be in those in-person relationships, and like just how to be, right? How to say, I could learn something from you. You're allowed to change your mind. I'm allowed to change my mind. We're both trying here. So that's the assumption of good faith, right? That like, that I know you wouldn't actually try to mean this bad thing, right? Like your heart is good. And so from there, let's explore, right? Like that's very, I love that. And I'm glad that like we have people like you out there articulating that and engaging that way. And yet maintaining intellectual rigor too. So I just want to say thank you. I have found this really enjoyable, and I think that you and many others in your space exemplify the spirit that we're trying to lift up. And so just really grateful to you for joining us.
Thank you so
and for
much.
all of our, yeah.
Braver Angels is, I came to know John Wood Jr., one of your people, a couple of years ago when he moderated a debate that Brett and I did, both of us on one side and a couple of people representing the social justice side on the other. And since then, we've become friends, and I have been following your organization since then, and I'm just so thrilled at what you're doing. And I do feel that it is one of the avenues that actually stands to make a real difference.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, we sure hope so. I mean, like, yeah, and really everyone should hope so, because we've got to do something about this. I also, to that point, want to thank our listeners and all of you out here. Please, subscribe and like us on social media. Everybody wants that, but we do too. And if you're not a member yet, go to braverangels.org. It's and just join us, become part of this. This is part of, we're all facing this problem, and it's all of our responsibility to be part of the solution. So in whatever way, join us, and in your own life, just take that to heart and act on it. So thank you so much. You've been listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. We'll see you next time.